Now we're
Can you see the PowerPoint? Yeah, okay. Can everyone see that? Okay, so yeah, I am going to talk a little bit about a paper that I have been working on with Tammy and Paul and Cheryl Magsamen, which we're calling Moving the Needle. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of what we mean by that. And so I've prepared some slides, but feel free to interrupt me with questions because these are not, in the grand tradition of preparing to talk about things. I have thrown these together a little bit. So if there are things that are unclear, you have questions, feel free to stop me. Yeah, so one of the things that was funny is when I was putting together this presentation, I was like, I wonder what kind of needle we're envisioning. And so I offer two different potential needles here. So the first is the gas gauge and the second is the seismograph, right? So I think of this paper as kind of overall answering this question of what would it take, to move the needle on home health, right? And the way that I'm thinking about this is that I've kind of, we have a lot of established literature, right, that indicates what kind of a sizable problem home health risks are, right? So we know that people spend a lot of time in their homes. We know that homes can have a lot of health and safety issues, right? About 40% of homes have one or more health risks. A huge portion of that is just lead paint. We also know that this is getting worse, right? Homes are getting older, people aren't putting as much money into them, and so more homes are having risks in them. We know that the impact of these health risks on people's individual health is relatively sizable. So about 20% of people with asthma can attribute that to dampness or mold in the home. We know that some of this can be relatively serious, right? So 21,000 people die from radon-related lung cancer, which is the second leading cause of lung cancer. And we also know that this is costly at a societal level. So the economic burden of home health hazards altogether is in the billions. And each kind of, piece of home health can have an impact in the hundreds of millions. So in general, right, we know this is a serious problem. There's a lot of research that's being done to talk about, right, the health outcomes associated with home health risks, the societal costs associated with home health risks. And yet, kind of despite this, it doesn't seem like we're paying enough attention to it. And what's interesting about that is that housing and health have long kind of been tied together. So if you look at kind of the history of public health in the United States, a lot of it stems from issues of housing. So really early efforts of what we would call public health in the US were about how we could fix housing as a way to kind of improve people's lives. And so a lot of it was focused on tenements and slum housing and the problem of infectious disease and fires, and this perception that it led to kind of contagious immorality, right? Living in poor conditions. And so we have these sort of public health efforts that were completely, right, oriented towards housing, to thank for having, things like fire exits being mandated and kind of early building codes around safety, as well as sanitation guidelines around occupancy and plumbing, that kind of thing. And yet there's been sort of the shift over time, and I'm not going to get into it, but we can talk about it if you're interested, right? Where public health has really moved away from this perspective of looking at how health is tied to living conditions, right? We see some of this in conversations about the social determinants of health, but it's a very different kind of approach to health that we're seeing today. And yet public health journals are often publishing these kind of what I think of as like think pieces that are about why we should care about housing, right? Why housing should once again be kind of centered in public health debates. And so, right, you have this kind of twofold issue. On the one hand, we know it's serious. On the other hand, we know it's not being paid attention to. And so why is this is kind of the question. So the way I kind of formulate that is, despite what we know about the health impacts, the societal costs, and the frequency of home health risks, why doesn't home health kind of receive attention that's commensurate with its importance? And so the way that I approach this, being a sociologist, is you have to find a theory, right, that explains like why is it that we're not seeing this sort of level of attention that you see. Sociology is a very theoretically kind of founded field, and so we tend to look for explanations, right, that we can map on to whatever issue we're looking at. And so as we kind of discussed this topic, I thought a lot about the sociology of social problems, which is this perspective that has been used to account for things like drunk driving and smoking, as well as kind of juvenile delinquency, that kind of thing, right? All sorts of issues. The sort of foundational class in most sociology departments is called the sociology of social problems. And so we think of this as kind of the foundation of our field. And the basic argument of the sociology of social problems is that what is a social problem, right? So that means what is something that we see as needing to be solved, as like requiring attention, that these things are constructed and that they're not dependent on sort of objective circumstances. So basically, it doesn't matter how serious something is, right? It matters sort of how people are talking about and thinking about something. That's what determines whether or not people are going to pay attention to it. And so I focused in kind of particularly on this piece of the theory that's called the social structure of social problems, which focuses on the fact that in order for something to be kind of taken seriously, it needs to have kind of a set of conditions. So the first is it has to be perceived to cause social harm, and I'll talk about that more. And also that there has to be sort of clear causal and political responsibility for the issue. There's other pieces of this theory, but since I don't talk about them, I'm just not gonna go into that. But for responsibility, they break it up into causal and political. Causal is just this assertion about the sequence that factually accounts for the existence of a problem, right? What causes it, right? What are we saying is the thing that leads for one thing, like what leads like some set of circumstances to happen. And the second is political, which is who or what agency is obligated to address a problem. Yeah, so I can talk more about what I mean by constructed, if that's helpful. Tammy, I see your comment.
You don't need to. I just thought it was worth calling out and maybe referencing in the paper that not everybody thinks that way.
Yeah, for sure. And
it's obvious in hindsight, this notion of construction, but physical scientists like just think there is an objectivity because so much of what they deal with can be objectively founded, that the idea of importance, I think, just doesn't occur as a constructed idea.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, I mean, again, sociology is kind of founded on this idea of social construction. And so I really hammered into my students this semester, right, that we care about the fact that things are context dependent, right? They change over time. They change depending on the circumstances, and they change depending on who is kind of the one doing the analysis. And so one of the interesting things about some of these kind of foundational pieces on social problems is that they talk about things that we would not see as social problems today, right? So there's some really foundational work on smoking marijuana, right, as a social problem. And it talks about, right, this is this very deviant action. And right, of course, these things change over time. And so that's kind of one of the pieces of this is like, what the objective circumstances may not change, but how we're thinking about it does over time. So what I see us doing in this paper is kind of two things. First, we're laying out why it is that this set of objective conditions that kind of natural scientists have identified as being problematic, right? Why that has not risen to the level of a social problem. And then also talking about how these sort of things that prevent home health risks from being perceived as a social problem can be sort of manipulated in a way that could be kind of beneficial to how we respond to them. So I'm going to go through kind of first that argument about why kind of we argue that home health has not been sort of taken as seriously as it could be. And then we'll talk about sort of what we see as a way to respond to this. So the first is that home health is focusing on home health and this idea of social harm. So like I said before, there's this idea that, in order for something to be a problem, it must be perceived to be have a social harm. This means that it must impact kind of the public or some sort of shared resource. But homes are obviously perceived to be private. And so we see these homes as private, right? These are, if somebody is getting poisoned by lead in their home, that is something that is happening to them individually as a result of kind of their own lives, right? In their own home, even if it's happening systematically, right? Across the nation, right? And even if we know that people end up in homes through kind of, processes that are happening above them, right? So we know that people are sorted into neighborhoods in the social sciences as a result of overt discrimination, as well as things like real estate agents kind of telling or leading people towards certain neighborhoods based on their socioeconomic or racial status. So part of this is that we perceive as individuals home health risks to be something that only occurs in private homes. And this kind of violates the basis of our typical environmental actions, which are kind of organized around this idea of the shared commons. So because we see homes as private, we don't see any sort of health risk that happens within the home as hurting things that we share all together. The other thing is that home health risks are perceived to be a problem for some and not all. So we perceive home health risks to be something that happens to other people. And in particular, that it's something that happens to those in poverty or who are otherwise marginalized. And so as a result, this isn't seen as the kind of thing that affects all people, but rather some. And we'll talk about this a little bit in terms of sort of what it means for people to not see themselves in the issue, because I think part of that is really tied up with this sort of American culture of individual responsibility and why we sort of blame people for their own health. So the second piece of this is that home health issues tend to kind of violate this idea of having clear causal responsibility, right? So the second piece of how something becomes a social problem is that there's a clear sense of who is responsible for it, both in terms of who caused the problem and also who ought to respond. So causal responsibility for buildings is really complex, and we focus on three areas for this. The first is that just the pathways, right, of a health risk leading to a health outcome are really complicated. And so it can be difficult to identify kind of what that causal pathway is. The second is this idea of how individuals are responsible for their own health conditions. And so, right, can it be a social problem if it's something that is the result of individual action? And third, basically that it's complex because it's complicated. Like there are just so many people involved, right? How can you possibly identify which single person caused the health risk? And I will kind of break these down further. So to start, the causes of health outcomes can be really complicated. So first, you have to be able to disentangle housing from other social determinants of health. This can be really complicated for public health researchers who may be using data where it's hard to differentiate between kind of the quality of the housing or other kind of attributes of the housing itself and the attributes of the people living in those homes, right? So we know that people can end up living in substandard housing because they are low income or because they are people of color. And so those things may be perceived to be driving poor health outcomes as opposed to the housing itself, right? So trying to disentangle which is causing which is sort of a major question, right? It's difficult to do. And so as a result, you don't necessarily see a lot of strong causal language in public health around these issues. In general, also, public health researchers tend to be wary of making causal claims, and this is partially because their data tends to be able to speak to correlations as opposed to causation. And this can be an issue of basically translation, right? So, you have researchers who are making some claim about the relationship between dampness and mold in the home and asthma, right? But if they're unwilling to use the language of causality due to the nature of their data, then public the average person and public officials may then be uncertain of the strength of their claims, right? And so they may be unwilling to believe that an association exists, even if that's kind of what the research is saying, because we're so used to making these causal arguments when we're talking in terms of policy. And I think one of the clear examples of this is there is, when we think about like COVID, right, the way that people would hear the change in recommendations as evidence that you shouldn't trust any recommendations, right? As opposed to as evidence that our knowledge was changing, kind of getting better, being refined over time. And so part of this is kind of a communications piece. I'm just going to check the chat really quick because I'm seeing lots of little notifications pop up, so I want to make sure. Yeah, so one of the things we're working on is trying to bring in some of this like public health approach, right? How they talk about things. Because I think, right, I am less familiar, but there's this long history of trying to think about how to deploy public health messaging for for issues. And I think that there are reasons, right, why this kind of communication pattern exists, right? And so that's sort of the piece that that Cheryl is kind of building out for us. Yeah. The kind of next piece of why home health can be, the causality can be a little confusing, is the role of individuals. So, right, individuals can obviously cause health risks in their own homes. So, for example, if you have air quality like we had the last couple of days and you open the window, right, you are directly impacting the sort of health of your home. But not all home health risks are the result of individual actions. And so even kind of regardless of how active individuals are being in creating the circumstances in their own homes, there's this noted tendency to blame individuals for their health, right? And I think that for all of us, this is probably pretty intuitive, just because in general, kind of there is an American culture, right, of individual responsibility that sort of, has these sort of expectations about our responsibility for our own kind of well-being, right? So we see this both historically and in the social science literature. So historically, there were all of these debates, right, about whether or not lead should be banned in paint and in gasoline. And at the time, typically parents were blamed for lead poisoning. So the kind of paint companies and gasoline companies would say, like, basically, if you watched your kids, it wouldn't matter that there was lead in the paint and the gasoline, right? You also see this in the literature. So sociological research on kind of environmental degradation has found that parents are often blamed, even when there's clear evidence that the pollution is coming from kind of elsewhere. So people will blame parents for not kind of doing enough for their children, even if you can tell that there is kind of the presence of environmental pollutants kind of around you. And within public health, this is kind of a part of a broader trend where, despite the fact that most public health interventions start with kind of an acknowledgement of the importance of structural or social determinants of health, typically they end up drifting downstream to be these kind of individual prescriptions. And so this again kind of shows that we tend to put kind of individuals first when it comes to health. And so if you are seeing home health risks as something that is the result of individuals, right, then you're not going to in turn believe that there's any need to intervene, right? This is a problem of individuals. So it kind of goes back to that idea of privacy and whether or not this requires a kind of a public response versus a more individual one. And the last piece is that basically it's just really, homes are complicated, right? Lots of people interact with homes. And the way that we typically respond to these kind of environmental health issues or just environmental issues is this polluter pays principle, where the person who originates the environmental harm is responsible. But if you can't tell whether a home health risk is the response, is due to how the architect kind of designed the building, or how it was built ultimately by construction personnel, or how it was maintained either by a property management company or the person living there, right? It's going to be hard to know who to blame. And so as a result, it can be kind of demobilizing, right? Nobody wants to take the blame. Nobody's quite clear where the health risk comes from. And so people instead kind of step back and do nothing. And this is kind of, I think, made worse by the fact that homes obviously have kind of long lives, right? Homes switch ownership, they switch kind of maintenance personnel, people may put on additions, they may remove things, right? All of this kind of interaction with the home, the fact that the home is changing and changes hands, means that kind of pointing to who particularly caused a specific health risk can be really difficult. And again, that can make it harder to have any leverage, right, to get people to act on behalf of the home. So finally, I think that this is all compounded by the fact that there isn't any sort of single agency that's responsible for homes. So typically in situations of environmental or health impacts, we follow kind of a top-down approach, right? Where you expect that some sort of single agency or organization will mandate certain standards, right, for whatever you're kind of concerned about. But homes are actually not the domain of any single federal agency, and we also don't kind of hand off responsibility for homes to others, right? To state or local regulation. So this was also true historically. There's lots of historic documents that talk about this fight when it came to regulating lead paint, about the fact that HUD didn't want to be responsible for regulating homes because they don't see all homes as kind of their domain, but rather kind of urban development. The EPA didn't want to take it on because they see themselves as dealing with the outdoor environment, right? And so as a result, you have this sort of space where nobody is taking responsibility. When you look at current federal responses, the current federal Healthy Homes Task Force has over a dozen kind of agencies who are taking kind of piecemeal responses to the issue. So you have HUD, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Center for Disease Control, the EPA, Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the Office of the Surgeon General, right, who are all taking on pieces of this. And if you look at specific healthy homes programs, right, these tend to be kind of sprinkled across these agencies, but none of them are taking on regulatory responsibility in particular. So unlike with other environmental or health risks where you can kind of go to the agency whose domain, whatever the environmental or health risk is, and kind of ask them to intervene, there is no person to ask to intervene when it comes to homes. And I think I talked to you all about the kind of vignette project I did, but another piece of this is just that we also think of homes as special. I didn't include this because I'm not sure it's going to go in the final paper, but we don't guarantee people privacy, but we do guarantee people privacy in their homes, right? Homes are a special legal domain that have special protections that are different from other spaces. And so because of that, there's a higher burden to intervene in homes than there are elsewhere, which kind of adds kind of a further layer of complexity to getting some sort of agency or some level of government to take this on seriously. Okay, so then we have kind of a twofold proposal that basically looks at this issue and says, the issue of causal and political responsibility is complicated, right? There are these kind of multiple actors who are involved. Trying to figure out who should take it on is complicated. Nobody wants to take it on. And so we are sort of saying that the kind of typical response to this, which is just like, we should care more, doesn't do enough to sort of speak to the different people who are involved. And so basically we're seeing that this diffuse responsibility, or what I sometimes am calling fragmentation, is actually a strength of the response because it enables us to look at both kind of who is creating certain circumstances and who is responding to certain circumstances. And so we kind of recommend both what I see as kind of a housing and a health response. So speaking both to kind of the health establishment and the housing establishment. And so I'm calling these thinking of homes as a domain of health. So basically, home should be understood as a domain of health. A domain in the health literature is a class of exposures. In this case, it would be based in place. So exposures are already grouped together into other domains. So for instance, multiple pollutants like particulate matter or ozone are understood to be a class of exposures that occur in the air. So basically, we're just saying that radon, mold, lead, and these other home health risks are their own class of exposures. And the reason why this is helpful is it gives a language for why these should be considered together, because in a lot of these analyses, they're focused on single pollutants rather than kind of all of the pollutants that are happening in the same space, which is part of what makes it difficult, right, to argue that this is an issue of homes as opposed to an issue of dampness, lead, radon, right, all of these individual issues, but is instead something that needs to be considered together. And then the second piece of this is that health needs to be considered an attribute of housing. So most kind of building scientists, so I'm thinking of that as the research side, and building practitioners, who are kind of the people doing the hands-on work on the other side, do not perceive health to be an attribute of buildings or kind of an aspect of their work. So building scientists may measure concentrations of pollutants, but they don't necessarily connect these concentrations to health outcomes. And building practitioners may, take into account certain aspects of the environment or the people living in a space when they're trying to decide what system or what type of intervention to do in a building. So they may think of cost or energy efficiency, but they may not be considering health, right? And so trying to integrate health as just a normal attribute of buildings would have them kind of take that into account. And so there has been a lot of attention on the health side, right, of why public health folks should take kind of housing more seriously as an element of overall health. But part of that is also having people who are involved in kind of housing systems think about health as part of their work, and requires kind of their buy-in, right? Because they're the ones who are supplying the systems which ultimately kind of determine how healthy or unhealthy a home may be. Yeah, so I think that's everything I have. I am happy to take questions or talk about it more. I feel like I went really quickly, so.
Paige, I'll start. I was wondering, have you guys looked at the stuff, so like one area, that idea of, how it's framed in the public's eye, and there's the stuff by Entman. There's looking at problem definition, causal chain, priming. I should know all 5 pieces of this, but it's basically looking at, how it's talked about is also, and the forces that are trying to frame it in different ways, which gets into that, the politics of it, and responsibility. And part of that can also be that, is it framed as a social problem or is it framed as an individual problem? That is an area when you're thinking about how you're gonna try to frame it as home as a domain of health. So you're thinking about, well, how can we basically reorient people to thinking about it in this different way? Some of his work, and if you want, I'm happy to send you some sites and things on that. That may be helpful to you. And there's been a little bit of work kind of thinking about that idea of who's responsible. Is it the individual? Is it society? And there's been some experimental work looking at how different ways of framing that issue encourage people to think in a particular way that might encourage them, for example, to support a public, a policy. So instead of them thinking, and who's responsible, and should it all be at the individual level, or can we, work out a way to have people recognizing that these are more systemic and societal level problems, because I think that's the key to getting enough resources, both from a human standpoint and from people talking about it, and get agencies reframed so that it's like, yeah, this is our job.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the kind of framing piece, I think, as a group, and some of it makes it into the paper, but not explicitly. Like one of the things we talk about is if you're thinking of who is doing a lot of the kind of definitional work, it probably lives in these kind of healthy homes programs, right? And so, for instance, when talking about is it perceived as kind of this like individual or more shared problem, like the language of healthy homes is really individual, right? It's about the actions that you can take as an individual to make your home healthier. So yeah, I definitely think that's part of it, and I would appreciate if you sent, I'm always happy to read more sites. So.
Well, and I think too, that does bring up the idea. Part of the reason I think we go at the individual level is because we can do that.
Mm-hmm.
In public health messaging, it's like, okay, we've got a big problem and we're trying to move the needle a little bit. Okay, so we can, typically within any system where there is a big problem, there are some individual level actions that can help slightly. You can think about that with, the climate crisis. And people talking about, well, does it matter whether you do little things or big things and stuff, and people's agency and their hopefulness, that's another thing we're looking at. But I think that is the reason that sometimes we start small. The last thing I'll say is that you might, and you probably already are, the way radon has when it started like in the 80s is when I'm going to say, like, the EPA kind of started getting really excited about it. And they started messaging about it and they started talking about it. And then you see cities starting to bring in, and you can get tests for it. And you could get, that might be a way to see here is a problem. And granted, it was pretty easy to find the problem, and so that probably helped in the scheme of life. But looking to see which organizations did come on board with that and how cities and other places started changing building codes and started doing stuff like that, that could provide some ideas.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been really interesting thinking about this is trying to think about how the issue differs if you focus on individual home health risks versus if you think of them as kind of a collection, right? This like umbrella category, because so the issue I'm most familiar with is lead, right? And so if you look at the history of lead poisoning, right, there's like pretty clear causal evidence, right, of the relationship between lead and a series of neurological issues, right? And we have pretty clear evidence of the societal costs of this, right? And so you see pretty robust regulation, robust intervention programs. But when you take all of these issues as like a collective of things, right, a domain, that all of these things that happen in homes, right, they're treated very differently than if you focus on the things where there is really clear causal evidence. Yeah, Tammy?
So I just wanted to provide some guidance to people, and it's not that I want to shut down discussion, because I want all the discussion and I want all the ideas, but Paige's last day is next Friday. And then she's going to go have a job. And so what she should do is finish this paper. And so the kinds of things that would be useful are, you should consider this, or this kind of work would really build that out. Suggestions about we need to reanalyze this in a different framework are going to go perhaps to the next postdoc. And so again, that's not to shut down any ideas, because I want to hear all of them, but there is an end date for the work that Paige is presenting now. So just keep that in mind, that if your wonderful idea is not taken up, it is because of this limited time, which is unfortunately the nature of many positions. And I will also say, this is why we hired Paige. And when did you start, Paige? Was it April, like 2 years ago?
Yeah, 2021.
So this, even though this team has seen Paige mainly working on the survey, this that she just presented is really what she was hired to build out. Like we started this like what the hell is going on? We do not understand why this is such a problem. That was our language at that point. I'm sure, Marilee, that you provided more sophisticated language than that, but I think many of the physical scientists were like, and continue to be like, this should be important. Why is it important? And so just to having or being able to present a way to discuss that, I think has been a journey in itself.
Well, and I do like the two ideas. I mean, the home as a domain of health, that this is this is a place, and we need to, to be thinking about it from that standpoint. And I do like the idea of health as an attribute of housing, that both of those are really good ways to organize ways of thinking. They're good ways to organize, like, who needs to learn about this, and who needs to be paying attention to it. So I think those two ideas are quite good. And there's a lot of good stuff that you're doing. As a reviewer, I might be like, with some of the stuff that I've been mentioning and others have in the chat, is like, you may need to like add a sentence that says, like, we recognize X, we recognize Y, so that you don't have to talk about them, but so they don't ding you big time. Because a lot of what you're dealing with is power, and who has it and who doesn't, and the recognition of that. And you may want to put that in there, recognize it, and kind of maybe then set it aside to some degree, so that it's like, we recognize that this is part of what we're trying to address here. But if we set it aside a little bit and we think about the home as a domain, and stuff, then I think then someone will be like, okay, fine, I don't have to, like, all the alarms going off in my head about power, I can put them over there, and I'm gonna come to this land with you of thinking in this other way.
Yeah.
And so I think if you can, so that would be my, like, as far as like little things that you might add. And right. I apologize in advance if this really messes up your paper, but I mean, that could help you with reviewers and stuff like that, is part of what I'm thinking about, from that standpoint. Then my last thing about thinking of home as a domain of health, I noticed that you're not thinking about air in the home, particularly. I mean, and I was curious about, like, since the home it's not a vacuum, or it's not a closed system. And maybe that's part of what you talk about, is this idea of home as a domain of health, recognizing it's not a closed system. We're going to address these issues. So you're going to leave air to the EPA, maybe, or something,
Yeah. So we do, I mean, we talk about air, and like that's part of this framing. I think that I don't use air as an example as much, because air is an example of one of these public health issues where the science is not strong enough that people are making causal arguments, right? And so most of the examples I draw from are in the things where there's kind of more established research. I talk a lot about mold and dampness, right? And its relationship with asthma, but we do talk about kind of air as part of it, because I think that the types of risks that exist in a home related to air can be treated differently than the types of risks that occur elsewhere. Yeah, so by not established, I mean, so when I talk about the piece of one of the difficulties of this is that, right, the causal relationship between health risk and outcome is not super explicit. One of the things that Cheryl and I have talked about is the relationship between some indoor air quality risks and health outcomes is not considered. It's considered correlation, not causation at this point. It's considered an association. Whereas most of the examples that I am trying to build off of are the pieces that public health has been pretty clear about, the fact, like, that these are things that have a causal, the health risk has a causal relationship. Yeah, so outdoor air pollution is, but the work on indoor air is considered like more in its infancy, I guess, is my perception of things based on talking to Cheryl. So I mean indoor air quality is definitely in the manuscript, right? We talk about the costs of indoor air and the health impacts of indoor air. It's part of it. I just don't focus on it as kind of the central piece of what home health means, because I think that it's easier to rely on these. Yeah, we can talk more about it. These kind of other pieces, just because they're less debatable. I don't want to get into, I think what I'm trying to say is I don't want to get into a debate about the role of indoor air quality. And so I'm trying to focus on the parts of this big umbrella, right, that are established. As for the discussion of power, I do want to speak to that really quickly. So like, definitely, I include discussions of power in part to prove that this is a systemic problem, right? Because when you talk about the fact that, you know, power is operating and it determines where people live, I think it makes it more compelling that this is an issue of public health as opposed to individual choice. And so we talk a bit about kind of how people end up getting kind of systematically sorted in ways that kind of align with power dynamics. So there is a little bit of that, but yeah, I'll be attentive to yeah, what I don't talk about, right?
And I agree with you there. I mean, as far as that you do have it. I was just thinking about like how people think about it, that there's a lot of groups are interested in having it framed in a way that doesn't make them responsible.
Mm-hmm.
And that stuff. And so that was kind of what I was thinking about more, is like that. And when people haven't thought about something much and you raise it as a public health problem or a problem, then they look to these outside signals to them about what the heck it is. We can think
Right.
about that gun violence and the attempts to make it, you know, it's been, let's make that a public health issue. And I think they may have said it was.
Right.
But that's more what I meant. But I agree with you. You got power in there. It's just, I was thinking of the folks who are trying to manipulate the space.
Yeah.
They're not in charge. It's not their problem.
Yeah, that's like the piece of the theory that I didn't include in this is like they talk about it as ownership, right? Who owns the issue and is the one considered to like be able to exert power over how things are defined. What's interesting, I mean, this is just an aside, so I won't go too far into it, is I don't actually think there is a lot of ownership in the healthy home space. I don't think that there's a lot of interest groups who are doing the work of definition. And so we talked a little bit about that, but there are so few that it feels a little bit like we're picking on people if we go too far into it. So.
But Paige, you mentioned that there are people who are interested in not being targeted as responsible. Isn't that also a facet of power?
Yeah. I think that I think that's true. And so I think that that's part of why, like, I think the difference is that it's in the past when we talk about how people have tried to avoid blame, it's usually been kind of more organized people, right? And these are just like sort of random individuals, right? So your contractors and your maintenance guy and whatever, right? And so I think that piece is there, but I think it's the kind of thing that we can set aside, and maybe we set it aside explicitly, because I think that if the emphasis is that like this has to become a thing that is being considered at kind of multiple levels, right? That is sort of, I think, how we see it as being responded to, right? If you have contractors and code enforcement people and et cetera, right, who are all taking health as an attribute of buildings seriously, then it's that power dynamic is addressed. But I don't think that that's really something that we're talking about all that much.
You also want to say this is really cool stuff. So this is one of the key thing trying to what you're doing. I really like this. So thanks.
Yeah, no worries.
Thanks for your comments, Marilee. I hope nothing I said made you feel like I did not want to consider your arguments.
Oh, no, not at all. No, you're great.
Allison, maybe we can maybe Paige can follow up with you offline on those suggestions. I know she went back and forth a lot with Cheryl, and that choice really came out of that discussion. So
Also word count. A lot of it came out of word count.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Anyone else have final questions? Okay, great. Paige, thanks for your presentation. You made it very beautiful also. It's nice to have people with attention to aesthetics in the room.
I try.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Have a good
Thanks,
week.
Paige.
Thank you, Paige.
Thanks.